I never thought the most dangerous threat to everything I had spent a decade building would arrive quietly, carried in my mother's voice, in a kitchen I had grown up in. My name is Genevieve. I'm 33 years old. I'm a licensed pharmacist, and I own an independent pharmacy in Mississauga. It isn't a large operation. 4 employees, a dispensary that stays busy on weekday mornings, a small front section with vitamins and health supplies, and the particular smell of a pharmacy that has been in the same space for a long time. I bought out the previous owner when I was 29, using everything I had managed to save since graduating, taking on a business loan, and working the kind of hours that don't leave much room for a personal life. I've never pretended it was glamorous. It was necessary, and I did it. My parents came to Canada from the Philippines before I was born and raised my younger sister and me in Etobicoke. My father spent his career as a vice principal at a public school in Brampton. My mother stayed home until we were both in secondary school, then worked part-time at a florist's until she retired. They were careful people who saved with discipline and understood the value of stability, which is probably where I got it from. My sister Delphine is 4 years younger than me, and she has always approached life differently. I don't say that as a criticism. She genuinely has a kind of creativity and restlessness that I've never had, and for a long time I only admired it. When she was in her mid-20s, that restlessness became a boutique clothing shop she opened on Queen Street West. I think it lasted 14 months before the lease costs outpaced the sales. After that came an online wellness coaching business that had a beautiful logo, a clean website, and a following that never quite translated into enough paying clients to be sustainable. My parents supported her through both of those ventures, not just with encouragement, but with money. My father made an early RRSP withdrawal to cover some of the costs when the shop closed. The following year, my parents remortgaged their house to help Delphine get herself back to zero. I didn't know the full extent of that until much later. By the time I found out, it also explained why certain solutions that seemed obvious to everyone on the outside weren't actually available to them. I never judged Delphine for those failures. I have run a small business. I know what can go wrong and how fast. What I noticed, quietly and over many years, was the way those failures were framed in our family, as chapters, as learning, as proof that she was courageous and creative and still finding her way. When I passed my PBC licensing exams on my first attempt, my mother made a nice dinner. When I finalized the purchase of the pharmacy, my father said he was proud of me. Both moments were warm, and both moments were brief, because my successes had been absorbed into the background noise of what was simply expected from me. I've done enough thinking about it to understand what was actually happening. Delphine's path felt uncertain and therefore significant. My path felt stable and therefore invisible. My parents weren't being unfair on purpose. They were being human in a specific way that I suspect many responsible children will recognize. Last spring, Delphine came to me with a new idea. She wanted to open a Pilates and wellness studio in Toronto's West End, near Roncesvalles. She had completed 2 instructor certifications, had a commercial space in mind, and had built an actual spreadsheet, client projections, overhead costs, a break-even timeline. It was the most thorough work I had seen from her, and I told her so honestly over coffee at my kitchen table. I meant it. I was glad for her. I also made her an offer. I told her I had some room in my professional corporation, and that if she was interested, I would consider coming in as a 30% equity partner, not as a lender, as a co-owner, with quarterly reporting and a voice in major decisions. She smiled, shook her head, and said she didn't want it to feel like being managed. She wanted the studio to be entirely hers. I respected that. We hugged at the door when she left, and I thought that was the end of my involvement. I had no reason to think otherwise. It was the second Sunday in April. I had stopped by my parents' house in the early afternoon to return a bag of containers my mother had left at my place the weekend before. The kind of small errand that takes 10 minutes. I have a spare key. I let myself in through the side door the way I always do, and called out to let them know I was there. I didn't hear an answer, but I could hear my mother's voice coming from the kitchen. I assumed she was on the phone. I set the bag down on the hallway table and was about to call out again when I heard my own name. My mother was talking to someone, a relative, from the tone of it, easy and familiar. She was talking about Delphine's studio loan as though it were already in process. She mentioned that the bank had asked about a co-signer with sufficient financial standing. And then she said, in the confident and offhand voice of someone describing something already settled, that I would be taking care of that part. She listed what I had, my business, my TFSA, my RRSP contributions, the equity I held in the pharmacy, the way someone recites items from a pantry. Then she said she was going to let me know soon, so I'd be ready to sign when the appointment was booked. Not that she was going to ask me. That she was going to let me know, so I'd be ready to sign. I stood in that hallway without moving for a moment. Then I picked up the bag I had just set down, walked back out the side door, and drove home. I want to say something clearly about what I did that evening, because I think the order of things matters. I did not call Delphine. I did not send my mother a message asking her to explain herself. I did not spend the night running through possible interpretations of what I had heard or talking myself into believing it was something other than what it was. I came home, made a proper dinner, sat at my kitchen table, and treated the situation exactly the way I would treat a serious problem brought to me by a patient, calmly, systematically, one step at a time. The first call I made was to my accountant. She has managed the pharmacy's books for 5 years and knows my financial position as well as anyone. I told her what I had heard. She listened without interrupting, and when I was finished, she said something I wrote down afterward. That assumptions made out loud have a way of hardening into expectations before anyone officially agrees to anything. She told me not to wait for a formal ask that might never come in the form I expected. We needed to look at what was currently lendable in my name and make sure nothing could be offered up without my explicit involvement. My professional corporation already existed. Incorporating is standard practice for pharmacists in Ontario, mainly for tax planning purposes. What my accountant and I did over the following days was more intentional than what I had done before. We moved personal investment accounts under the corporate structure, formalized ownership of certain assets, and worked with my lawyer to ensure that the documentation accurately reflected where everything actually sat. The goal wasn't to conceal anything. It was to make the picture correct, to make sure that what I owned in my own name reflected my actual decisions and not someone else's plans for me. My RRSP and TFSA are protected instruments in their own right, but I had my lawyer document my complete financial position regardless, so that any institution asking would receive a current and accurate answer, not a 2-year-old summary that no longer reflected reality. The restructuring took just under 2 weeks. It was careful, slightly exhausting work, and I am glad I had finished it before what happened next. 12 days after that Sunday afternoon, the main phone line at the pharmacy rang during the lunch hour. My technician transferred the call to me, thinking it was a supplier. Instead, a woman introduced herself as a lending specialist from one of the major Canadian banks and thanked me warmly for agreeing to support Delphine's loan application. She said they only needed to verify a few details to finalize my profile as the co-signer, and they could then move toward approval. I asked her to hold. I walked into the back room and sat down at my desk. Then I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, to email me every document in the file that included my name before we spoke further. She agreed without hesitation, clearly treating it as a routine request. The email arrived within the hour. I opened the attachments and found a financial summary I recognized immediately. I had prepared it 2 years earlier, when the pharmacy completed its best fiscal year since I took ownership. At the time, I had printed a copy and brought it to Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Not as a formal document, but as something I wanted to share with the people I was close to. My father had looked it over and nodded. I remember feeling quietly proud. I had never imagined that document leaving our family in any form. My mother had submitted it to the bank as evidence of my financial standing. The covering note she had included described me as a willing cosigner who was currently reviewing the paperwork. I read that sentence twice. I saved every attachment and forwarded the entire thread to my lawyer, with a short note asking her to review everything before I responded to anyone at the bank. Then I went back out to the dispensary and finished the afternoon. The conversations with my family were harder than the legal process. I called my mother 3 days later. I kept my voice steady and I told her directly. I was aware that my financial information had been submitted to a bank on my behalf, and that my participation in the loan had been described as confirmed when it had never been discussed with me at all. I told her that my accounts, my business records, and my financial position were not available to anyone to use or discuss without me being part of the conversation. If Delphine needed a cosigner, she could ask me. My answer would start with a real conversation. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said this wasn't about money. She said family helps family. She said I was turning something straightforward into something complicated. I told her that helping someone is a choice, and that a choice requires being asked. Deciding for someone and then informing them is not the same thing. That call ended shortly after. My father called the following evening. He was quieter than my mother, but said something that stayed with me. That they had expected me to be reasonable about this, and that my response was creating difficulty that didn't need to exist. I told him I agreed the difficulty didn't need to exist. I said it could have been avoided completely if anyone had spoken to me before speaking to a bank. He had nothing to say to that. Delphine called on a Thursday evening. She sounded confused more than angry, which I found easier to receive. She told me the bank had paused the application and she didn't understand what had changed. I told her gently but plainly that I had never agreed to co-sign the loan. I told her I had never been asked. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that our mother had told her everything was already arranged. That sentence was the one that hit me most directly. Not because of what it said about my mother. Because of what it said about how long this particular dynamic had been operating. My dependability had become something the people around me felt they could deploy on my behalf. My reliability wasn't recognized as something I chose. It had become an assumption so thoroughly embedded in how my family understood me that no one had thought to question whether it required my consent. I had once offered Delphine a formal partnership. A real financial stake in the business, with terms and accountability. She had turned it down because she didn't want to be managed. Now my assets were being offered to a bank without so much as a phone call to me. The distance between those two things is not small. The bank scheduled a meeting for the following week. My mother described it to Delphine as a chance to clear up a misunderstanding. I agreed to attend and asked to meet with the lending specialist alone first. Before anyone from my family arrived, the bank accommodated that request. When I sat down across from the lending specialist, a professional, thorough woman who had clearly not been given the full picture of the situation, I asked one question before anything else. I asked her to show me where in the file I had given written consent to be named as co-signer on this loan. She went through the file carefully. When she finished, she said there was no written consent from me. What existed was the financial summary my mother had submitted and the covering note describing me as a willing participant. I told her both had been submitted without my knowledge or approval. I also told her that the financial summary on file was 2 years old and no longer reflected my current position, that my personal assets had been reorganized under my professional corporation in the preceding weeks, and that the individual equity she had been looking at was no longer held in my name in a form lendable as personal collateral. I gave her my lawyer's contact information. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something has been clearly settled. She made notes in the file. We spoke briefly about process. She confirmed that the application could not proceed in its current form without significant restructuring. I thanked her, gathered my folder, and stood. I was in the lobby pulling on my coat when the elevator doors opened and my mother walked in. She was in her good coat, handbag over one arm, the purposeful expression she always carries when she has decided in advance how a conversation will go. She looked at me and smiled, careful, warm, already composing the explanation. I held the door for her and let her go ahead. Then I walked to my car and drove home. Delphine told me later that my mother had sat in that meeting room for a long time after speaking with the lending specialist, that the file had been shown to her, that she had tried twice to redirect the conversation toward what she felt was the misunderstanding at the center of it, that the lending specialist had not found a misunderstanding in the notes. My mother had apparently sat very quietly after that. The months that followed were strange in their particular way. My mother and I didn't speak for almost 6 weeks. When contact resumed, it was careful and limited. How are you? How is work? Light things, nothing real. I wrote her a letter eventually. Not to argue the same ground again, but because I needed something said in a form she could read without interrupting. I told her what it had felt like to stand in her hallway and hear my future described as already arranged. I told her what consent means and why it mattered to me specifically. I told her that being the reliable daughter had never meant she owned what I had built. She called after receiving the letter. She said she loved me and that she was sorry things had become so difficult. It wasn't a direct accounting of what had been done, but there was something in it that felt genuine, and I accepted it as what it was. Delphine and I arrived somewhere better, though it took longer. For a while she was angry with me in a way that I understood was easier than being angry with our mother. It wasn't until late summer that we had a real conversation, over an hour on a weeknight, the most honest exchange we'd had in months. She told me she had been humiliated in a way she hadn't anticipated. Finding out that she had been told a guarantee was already in place, when the other person had never actually been asked, had changed how she understood what had been done on her behalf. She told me she had gone back to the beginning. She had found a colleague, another certified instructor, who had her own small client base and was interested in building something together, rather than working for someone else. With both of them standing behind the application, the bank had approved a smaller loan amount, enough to open a modest space in Parkdale, 2 treatment rooms and a reformer studio that fits 8 people at a time. She sent me a photo the morning they put the sign up. I looked at that photo for a while. I am genuinely glad she found her way to something that is actually hers. A co-signer who chose to be there, a partner with real skin in the game, a business that began with honest terms. That is what the loan should have looked like from the start. I hope the studio does well. I think it will. My father and I talk regularly. We have quiet agreements about which subjects to approach carefully, and I have made peace with that arrangement. He was never the one who submitted documents to the bank or made representations on my behalf. His role in what happened was subtler. The unexamined confidence that I would simply agree once the decision was presented to me. I understand where that confidence came from. I also know it can no longer be the default. My professional corporation continues to do what it was always meant to do. The pharmacy had a strong year. My TFSA contributions are on track. Every significant financial decision in my life begins and ends with a conversation I am present for. What I think about sometimes is the particular difficulty of being the person who always manages. Not a difficulty anyone imposes deliberately, more of a structural problem that builds slowly, over years, without anyone consciously designing it. When you are the person in a family who pays her bills on time, and saves carefully and builds something real through patience, the people around you gradually stop perceiving those behaviors as choices. They start perceiving them as a kind of standing resource. They stop thinking about what it cost to build what you built, and start thinking about what it could do for someone else's situation. I don't hold bitterness about it. I hold clarity about it, which is different and more useful. The afternoon I stood in my parents' hallway and heard my savings described as a logistical detail in someone else's plan. That moment was a gift, even if it didn't feel like one. It told me something true that I had been sensing for years without having a clean example of it. It told me that the boundaries I believed existed had never been formally established. They had simply been assumed, on both sides, and assumed differently. And it gave me the chance to establish them on my own terms, without drama, without accusation, without anything except a quiet set of legal decisions and a willingness to let the paperwork speak clearly. I didn't raise my voice at anyone. I didn't threaten to cut off contact or tell relatives what had been done. I called my accountant. I called my lawyer. I reorganized what was mine, and I let the documentation do what documentation is designed to do. If you are the person in your family who always figures it out, who manages her life carefully, and builds something real and never asks for help, and is therefore assumed to be available whenever someone else needs a solution, I want you to hear this clearly. What you have built belongs to you. The fact that you handled your finances responsibly does not make your savings a family emergency fund. The fact that you are stable does not mean your future is available to be borrowed against without asking. Helping the people you love is one of the most worthwhile things a person can do. But it has to remain a choice, made freely, after a real conversation, on terms you have agreed to. The night I drove home from my parents' house with a bag of Tupperware in the back seat, and everything I had just heard sitting in my chest, I didn't feel angry. I felt unusually calm. I already knew what I was going to do. I knew that doing it quietly and correctly was the only version of this I could live with. There are moments that look like nothing. A door left slightly open, a voice carrying down a hallway, a sentence heard by accident, that end up being the moments that change everything. Not because of what was said, but because of what they make clear. And once something is clear, you can act on it. Carefully, thoroughly, and entirely on your own terms.